23 seconds. That's all it took for over 200 elite guests at a diplomatic banquet to laugh at one woman because of her skin, her silence, and her worn-out shoes. But then, everything stopped when they realized she was President Traoré's first love. So now ask yourself who truly didn't belong in that room. It was the kind of night that didn't need introductions. The chandeliers inside the West Wing of the Foreign Embassy glittered like galaxies trapped in crystal. Strings of golden light danced off champagne flutes, polished marble floors reflected the swirl of silk gowns and lacquered shoes. The air smelled like expensive perfume, and old money soft, luxurious, and just slightly suffocating. This wasn't just a banquet, it was the banquet, the one held once a year to honor global partnership and progress. But everyone knew it wasn't really about unity. It was about status, about who got invited and who didn't, about which names were whispered with awe and which ones were conveniently forgotten. Cameras flashed from the corners of the Grand Hall, but never indiscriminately. They were aimed like sniper lenses at familiar faces, powerful alliances. A rising minister from Brussels, a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley, a cultural attaché from Paris whose smile could close million-dollar deals. Their laughter rose and fell in gentle waves, never loud, always controlled. Even amusement here was political. Waiters in white gloves floated between clusters of dignitaries, their trays lined with champagne, smoked trout, and slices of fruit shaped like lotus petals. Every step was choreographed. No spilled drinks, no wrong turns. The music, the kind that only lives in old record players and royal ceremonies, hummed softly in the background. A quartet played near the balcony, their expressions emotionless, their fingers disciplined like soldiers. The melody melted into the clinking of glassware and murmured diplomacy. At the center of the room stood Ambassador Renaud, tall, silver-haired, impeccably French. His navy tuxedo gleamed subtly under the lights. Beside him, his wife Clarice smiled like a painting, pleasant, unreadable, and utterly distant. Her diamond necklace alone could have paid the annual salaries of every guard at the gate. "Did you see who just walked in?" someone whispered behind a fan. "No, but I saw the Moroccan prince's aide sneak 2 invitations into his pocket." "Typical," someone else murmured. "And where's the president of Burkina Faso? Isn't he always late?" That question hung in the air just long enough to remind everyone whose presence truly mattered tonight. Then came the signal, a subtle one. A young aide walked briskly toward the front of the hall and whispered something into Ambassador Renaud's ear. He nodded, adjusted his cufflink, and motioned to the quartet. The music shifted, swelling into something grander. That meant one thing: the president's convoy had reached the outer gates. Phones went back into pockets. Glasses were refreshed. Makeup was checked. Spines straightened like dominoes snapping into place. If you were out of place in this room, this was your final chance to disappear. But what no one noticed, at least not at first, was that someone had already arrived. Quietly, without a convoy, without makeup, without a last name that opened doors. She had walked in just 3 minutes ago. No one knew her name. Yet. She stood near the back of the room, away from the gold arches and glittering chandeliers, her presence barely noticeable, until it became impossible to ignore. She wore a navy blue dress, not silk, not satin cotton, the kind of fabric you could fold 10 times and still fit into a village cupboard. A scarf wrapped around her shoulders, faded at the edges. Her shoes were worn, creased with time soles, thinned by miles that no limousine would ever understand. She didn't reach for a glass of champagne. She didn't smile at anyone. She didn't seem impressed. But her eyes, those eyes, moved across the room, not with awe but recognition, as if she had been here before. Not physically, but somewhere deeper, somewhere unshakable. She wasn't here for the champagne, or the photographs, or the applause. She was here for something else. And every second she stood there made people more uncomfortable. A waiter slowed as he passed her, unsure if he should offer a drink. 2 diplomats glanced her way, then at each other. Someone near the main table chuckled under his breath. "She must have gotten lost," he said. But she wasn't lost. She was waiting. For what? No one knew. Not yet. But when the doors opened, when the anthem played, when the most powerful man in the room walked in and passed every dignitary to stop directly in front of her, that's when everyone realized this night wasn't about them anymore. She didn't belong there. At least that's what the room had decided the moment she stepped through the door. The music didn't stop, but something in the air shifted, barely perceptible at first, like a hairline crack in a wine glass. Then came the stillness, the slow, collective double take. Laughter paused mid-breath. Eyes flicked. Whispers sharpened. It was as if someone had let a drop of ink fall into a pool of crystal water. The contrast was too clear, too jarring. There amidst a sea of gowns and tuxedos worth more than entire harvests stood a black woman in a plain navy blue dress. Cotton, wrinkled at the elbows. Her scarf was faded, draped loosely around her shoulders, like it had been tied quickly in passing. No jewelry, no designer clutch. Her shoes were simple, scuffed, practical, with cracked edges and soles worn thin by years of walking, not posing. She stood with her back straight, her expression unreadable. Her eyes didn't dart around nervously like someone lost. Instead, they moved slowly, steadily, taking in every inch of the hall, every guest, every chandelier, every forced smile. No one approached her, not at first, but the room responded in its own silent, ruthless way. A ripple of glances, raised eyebrows, a low chuckle from near the drinks table. One woman leaned into her husband's ear and whispered, "Did she think this was a soup kitchen?" He laughed behind his glass. "Maybe she's here to clean." It took only seconds for the assumptions to pile up. A staff member, a mistake. An outsider who had wandered into Power's playground by accident. But she wasn't wandering. She walked with purpose. Calm, unhurried, as if she had every right to be there, which of course made them more uncomfortable. She moved toward the main space where the high-ranking guests were gathered in clusters like planets around invisible suns. Her path took her near the central table where an empty seat had been left, reserved for someone important, someone not yet arrived. And that's when the aide stepped in. Young, sharp suit, hair slicked back with effort, eyes trained for power. His expression was polite but thinly veiled. His body language said it before his mouth did. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, planting himself firmly in her path. "I think you may have taken a wrong turn." "The service entrance is—" "I'm here for the reception," she replied. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Clear, calm, steady. It didn't ask for permission. The aide blinked. The smile tightened. "I'm afraid you're not on the guest list," he said, lowering his tone, trying not to attract attention, though it was already too late. All around them, people had begun to watch. Behind him, two women dressed in pearl and gold giggled into their flutes of champagne. "She thinks this is open seating," one muttered. "Maybe she's delivering something," said the other. A menu. A few feet away, a waiter hesitated, then in a well-practiced gesture, gently touched her arm. "Madam," he said in a hushed voice, eyes pleading, "let's not create a scene, please. This is a high-security event." She didn't move, didn't flinch. Her eyes met the aide's again. For a second, the air between them tightened like a pulled thread. "I didn't come for the menu," she said softly. "I came for what was promised." The room didn't know how to process that. The aide stood frozen, unsure if he should call security. The women whispered again. A diplomat shifted awkwardly. The waiter hovered. Something was clearly wrong, but not in the way they thought. And then outside the embassy came the sound that changed everything. Sirens. A sleek black motorcade pulled up to the embassy's front gate. Tires whispered against the marble driveway. The string quartet inside faltered mid-note as the doors opened with ceremonial grandeur. And when the president of Burkina Faso stepped into the room, broad-shouldered, regal in olive-red ceremonial wear, everyone turned. He walked past generals, past ministers, past journalists and donors. He didn't shake hands, didn't nod, didn't pause. His eyes scanned the room like he was searching for something, and then they found her. The woman who had just been laughed at, ushered away, whispered about. In that moment, the temperature of the room plummeted. Jaws clenched. Glasses froze midair. The aide who had blocked her suddenly couldn't move, because the President Traoré himself was walking toward her. Not toward the ambassador, not the press. Her. And in the silence that followed, no one dared breathe. The motorcade didn't roar, it glided, smooth, deliberate. 6 sleek black vehicles curled up the embassy's stone driveway, like a procession of armored shadows. Uniformed guards flanked the entrance, stiff and expressionless, while embassy staff straightened ties and jackets in nervous precision. The quartet inside adjusted their posture, switched tunes mid-bar, and raised the tempo. A swell of violins signaled the moment everyone had been preparing for. All eyes turned toward the grand entrance. And there he was. President Ibrahima Traoré of Burkina Faso stepped into the room, not like a man entering a party, but like a storm front slipping beneath a gilded ceiling. His ceremonial sash cut across a finely tailored dark crimson tunic, embroidered with delicate silver threading that shimmered faintly under the chandelier light. His presence wasn't loud, but it rippled, a silent authority that reached before him and pressed the room into breathless stillness. He did not smile. He did not greet. His eyes moved. One by one, the elites braced themselves for acknowledgement. The ambassadors, the ministers, the CEOs, they angled their shoulders, subtly inching into his line of sight. Expectation thickened in the air. Even Ambassador Renault, poised and practiced, cleared his throat and took a half step forward. But Traoré did not look at him. He didn't look at any of them. His gaze cut through the crowd like a memory surfacing, sharp, purposeful, unwavering. And then he saw her, the woman still standing quietly near the edge of the gathering. The same woman they had whispered about, dismissed, politely edged away from, like an error in decorum. She hadn't moved, not once. But something in her posture had shifted, a quiet bracing like the wind before a downpour. Traoré's pace slowed. His guards stayed at a distance. No one told him where to go. He didn't need direction. Each step he took toward her peeled layers off the room's illusion of control. He walked past a Nobel laureate, past a finance minister from Berlin, past an oil executive from Nigeria mid-toast. The room no longer mattered. The banquet didn't matter. The protocol dissolved under the weight of something far older than diplomacy. He stopped in front of her. There were no greetings, no titles exchanged, just a silence so heavy it made the chandeliers seem to dim. And then softly, in a voice that cracked just slightly, not with weakness, but with the gravity of remembrance, he said her name. My Adisa. The way he said it did something to the room, a word that had no context for them, but all the history in the world for him. His hands, strong yet slow, reached up and cupped her face with the kind of tenderness that didn't belong to politics. His thumb brushed her cheek, not in greeting, but in reverence. His forehead lowered toward hers, not quite touching, but close enough to carry weight. Gasps flickered across the hall. Someone dropped a glass. A ripple of murmurs followed. Did he just? Who is she? What's going on? Phones rose hesitantly, shaking in hands. One flash, then three, then a dozen. Live streams began. Screens lit up. Messages flew from one diplomat to another like wildfire. Who is she? Why is Traoré touching her like that? Is this his wife? No. It's something else. No one knew what to say, because nothing in their world, nothing in their carefully measured equations of class, power, and place had prepared them for this. Because Adisa, plain-dressed, soft-eyed, insulted just minutes ago, was now standing in the center of the world. And the man who led a nation had just shown everyone that the person they had deemed invisible was unforgettable. In that moment, everything stopped, and nothing would be the same again. Before the chandeliers, before the foreign dignitaries, and the murmured awe of powerful men, there was only dust. The village of Tibane sat quiet in the heat, where the wind carried the scent of dried millet and burnt charcoal, and red earth clung to bare feet like a second skin. Homes were built from clay, sun-baked and cracked at the corners, their tin roofs singing a soft metallic whine every time the midday sun pressed down. It was the kind of place maps forgot and governments remembered only during election week. But it was home. Every morning, long before the rooster crowed, Adisa would rise. Not because anyone woke her, but because she had trained herself to listen to the distant rhythm of the neighboring radio, the rustle of leaves in dry trees, the silence of her mother's sleeping breath. She moved quietly through the single-room hut, tied her faded scarf, and slipped out with a rice sack slung across her back. Inside were three things: a tattered exercise book, missing half its pages, a stub of a pencil barely long enough to grip, and a dream that was stubborn in its refusal to die. She walked 5 kilometers each way to school, barefoot, not because she wanted to, but because her only pair of sandals had fallen apart during last year's rainy season, and her mother hadn't the heart or the coins to say it wouldn't be replaced. The road was unkind, strewn with pebbles, bottle caps, sun-baked thorns that pricked her heels raw. Yet she never flinched. She knew the rhythm of the path by heart, where to avoid the broken glass, which stones stayed cool under the morning shade. As she reached the village school, a crooked building with walls more whole than brick and a roof that always leaked in the wrong season, she joined the line of students filing in. The boys always noticed her, not because she asked to be noticed, but because she didn't. They laughed at the rice sack she carried. One boy called it beggar's leather. Another asked if she used it to sleep under trees. "Do you wash with dust?" Adisa once sneered. "You always look like the ground." But she never responded. Not once. She didn't look down, didn't scowl, didn't offer even the satisfaction of a frown. She simply moved past them, head level, eyes forward, like wind passing through palm leaves. Because Adisa had learned something they hadn't. Noise didn't build futures. Discipline did. When her exercise book ran out of space, she wrote on banana leaves. Thin, torn, carefully cleaned with water from the communal jug dried under the sun and stacked under her mattress to flatten. She practiced math on the back of charcoal wrappers, copied poems on the brown paper her mother used to wrap fried cassava for sale. Her handwriting was narrow, precise, almost painfully careful, as if each letter had to earn the right to exist. In class, she said little, but her teachers noticed. How she memorized entire passages after one reading. How she fixed the grammar on the teacher's chalkboard without ever correcting him out loud. How she drew maps of the country from memory, not because she had ever traveled, but because she studied the shape of nations like other girls studied braids and bead patterns. Her uniform, second-hand and 2 sizes too large, hung from her shoulders like a borrowed promise. Yet she never asked for another. When it tore at the seam, she stitched it with thread taken from her mother's sewing box hands, steady eyes focused under the dim light of an oil lamp. When the rain came and others stayed home, she showed up early to help sweep the mud from the floor before class began. No one taught her to be proud. She simply was. Not loudly, not in the way people admire, but in the way bricks hold up a wall, quiet, unshakable, expected to bear weight. And when the other children went home to play, Adisa stayed behind, waiting for her teacher to lock the classroom. She would collect the leftover chalk nubs from the floor, wrap them in paper, and carry them home like treasures. That night, on the wall of her hut, she'd draw equations in the dim light, while her mother coughed softly in sleep. She didn't dream of castles. She dreamed of clinics, of shelves with medicine, of charts and files and thermometers that worked. Because long before she became the woman the world tried to forget, Adisa was the girl it never noticed. But she noticed everything. In a classroom filled with noise and heat, where the ceilings dripped with rain and the chalk dust hung thick in the air, one boy never joined the laughter. His name was Ibrahima. He didn't wear the finest clothes, but his shirts were always tucked in. His shoes were scuffed but mended with care. He sat near the middle of the classroom, not too close to the front, not hidden in the back, always watching, listening, calculating in silence. He wasn't the loudest or the most athletic or the boy teachers praised just to flatter his parents. But there was something in his posture and the way he carried himself that made others pause before speaking his name. He noticed Adisa before anyone else truly did. Not just her presence, but her patterns. How she held her pencil like it might break if she squeezed too hard. How she wrote in the margins when the page ended. How she answered questions without raising her hand, whispering the solutions into her cupped palms as if they were seeds she had no soil for. When the boys laughed, he didn't laugh. When they mocked her shoes, her silence, the rice sack on her back, he looked at them as if they'd embarrassed themselves, not her. And when one boy knocked the chalk from her hand during recess and grinned as it shattered, Ibrahima stepped between them, not with fists but with a stare that said, "You've already lost." He never asked her why she didn't fight back. He already understood. It began quietly, as most real things do. One afternoon, after a monsoon had swept through the village and left puddles in every crease of the road, the teacher dismissed class early. The students scattered toward home, splashing through the mud like it was a game. Adisa stayed behind as always. But that day, when she bent to gather the bits of chalk from the floor, she heard footsteps return. She looked up. It was him. Ibrahima didn't speak. He sat at his desk, pulled out his book, and began to write. At first, it was nothing more than coincidence. Then it became routine. They never planned it. No one said let's study together, but they did. In silence, side by side, in the still heat of afternoon, while the others chased clouds. When she worked, he worked. When she paused, he waited. And slowly, between equations and carefully drawn maps, they began to share more than answers. Sometimes they met under the old mango tree behind the school, where the sun filtered through the leaves in broken golden pieces. There, away from the others, they talked. He told her he wanted to be more than just a student. He wanted to serve, not with weapons or speeches, but with policies, papers change. She told him she wanted to heal people, to build a place where mothers didn't cry through the night over fevers that had no names. They didn't dream big because they were told to. They dreamed because it was the only thing no one could take from them. One afternoon, she looked at him and said, "You'll leave this place, I can see it." He looked back, eyes unwavering. "Then so will you." She shook her head. "Boys like you rise. Girls like me." "No," he cut in gently but firmly. "If I rise, you rise too." There was no declaration of love, no promises sealed with stolen kisses or wild vows. What they had was deeper. It was the understanding that two broken wings, if stretched together, could fly further than one perfect one ever could alone. In a village where futures were rationed like clean water, they became each other's well. And even though no one else noticed them, sitting under that tree year after year, something had been planted there. Something stronger than luck, stronger than fate, something that no banquet or border could erase. There was no ceremony, no trumpet, no gathering to wave goodbye. Just a bus with peeling paint, a cracked windshield, and an engine that coughed louder than it roared. And Ibrahima standing beside it in a pressed shirt too tight at the collar, his suitcase barely filled, but his eyes heavy with everything he couldn't carry. The letter had arrived folded in four, the seal from the capital barely smudged acceptance to the National Military Academy. Full scholarship, uniform, lodging, a future carved in stone. Everyone in the village called it a blessing. Everyone but Adisa. She didn't cry, not then. Not when he held her hand under the mango tree one last time. Not when he promised to write. Not when he whispered, "We're still walking the same path, just on opposite hills." She didn't say how steep her hill had become. Her mother's cough had deepened that month. Nights were no longer silent, just long stretches of wheezing damp cloths pressed to fevered skin, and bowls of water turned cold before the sun rose again. Her mother's fingers, once firm and quick with cooking or sewing, had grown frail, shaking as they reached for Adisa's cheek. School faded. Studying faded. Dreams faded in pieces. She stayed. Someone had to. And in staying, Adisa began to become something the village hadn't asked for, but quickly came to depend on. The nurse with no license. She had no clinic, only a woven mat near the edge of their hut. Her patients were farmers with sunburnt backs, children with fevered eyes, women too shy to speak their symptoms out loud. She treated snake bites with boiled roots, bandaged deep cuts with boiled fabric, soothed toothaches with cloves crushed into powder. Every night by candlelight, she studied whatever she could find. Old notebooks, borrowed, textbooks, scraps of medical pamphlets passed through truck drivers and market sellers. Her tools were basic clean water thread, salt neem leaves. But her hands were steady, her eyes were patient, and her heart, though tired, was still generous. People began to call her Doctora, not with sarcasm, but with a kind of reverence. The chief's wife kissed her hands after Adisa saved their youngest from a night fever. A traveling merchant brought her a real thermometer, once wrapped in a scarf like treasure. No one asked if she had papers. No one cared. She had something better, trust. But trust did not buy time. Her mother grew weaker. The rice sacks under the bed thinned. Adisa learned to make porridge stretch 3 days. She began to skip meals pretending she'd already eaten. She laughed less, slept less, but never lost the habit of straightening her scarf before facing the world. She still thought of Ibrahima. When the wind moved through the mango leaves, she remembered the sound of his voice. When she lit the candle to clean a wound, she imagined him reading under military barracks, scribbling strategy, and missing home. They had stopped writing the distance too wide, the silence too heavy. But she never hated him for leaving. He had walked toward duty. So had she. Just in different uniforms. No one ever believes war is coming until it's already there, until the silence sounds strange, until the birds stop singing, until the dust no longer smells like sun and grain, but like gasoline and steel. Tibane had always been a quiet place, forgotten, unimportant. But when the fault lines of politics cracked open across the country, even forgotten villages bled. The conflict started far from them in cities with names most villagers couldn't pronounce and speeches given by men they had never met. But eventually all wars come home. They arrive not with declarations, but with absence, the markets closing early, the trucks stopping at the edge of the forest, the soldiers' boots instead of merchants' carts. The clinic was the first to go. It wasn't much of a clinic, just a rectangular building with peeling blue paint and mismatched windows, but to the people it was sacred. It had vaccines and fans and sometimes even morphine. But as the unrest crept closer, the government pulled its staff back to the capital. Doctors disappeared in the middle of the night. Supplies dried up like rain in the dry season. A notice was nailed to the front door, closed until further notice. But Adisa stayed. She always had. When the other volunteers fled, when the trucks left with crates of medicine and the nurses whispered prayers before slipping away in the dark, she remained in the same place she had always been, in her hut with the faded curtains and the mat that served as her patient table. She did not argue with those who left. She only nodded gently, packed what they couldn't carry, and handed them boiled water for the road. Then she went back to work. When bandages ran out, she tore up her own clothes. Scarves became wraps. Underskirts became gauze. The faded hem of her mother's old dress became a tourniquet for a boy whose ankle had been caught in wire. For pain, she returned to the forest, searching for bitter leaves, scraping bark, boiling roots. Her hands began to smell not of soap or perfume, but of earth and iron and smoke. Children cried less when she was near. Somehow her voice, low and certain, could steady even the most fevered brow. Her presence was no longer questioned, it was assumed. When gunfire echoed from the hills, families didn't run. They came to her. Mothers carried toddlers with burns. Men arrived, limping shirts blood-soaked and tied with rope. She cleaned every wound, changed every dressing, stayed awake until the candles gave out, and she was left treating injuries by the flicker of a cooking fire. More than once, people asked her why she hadn't left. "You've done enough," one woman said, clutching a baby with infected lungs. "You don't owe us more than your life." But Adisa would only shake her head. "My mother stayed," she would reply softly, "and the sick don't walk." There were nights when fear crept in, when distant shouting made her hands tremble as she ground herbs, when a scream in the dark made her blow out the lamp and sit silently for hours listening. But fear was not new to her. Neither was loneliness. She had learned to live with both, like old roommates who didn't always pay rent. The village began to watch her in a new way, not just with gratitude but with reverence. Children who had once teased her now walked quietly past her hut. Elders who had once dismissed her now called her name before their final breath. She had no title, no diploma, no uniform, but in their eyes she was something rarer, the one who stayed. When the worst of the fighting swept through the neighboring district and another evacuation order was issued for all civilians, she folded it carefully and used the back of the paper to write her inventory of herbs. Adisa never said it out loud, but her actions spoke louder than any general. This was her battlefield, and she had chosen to fight with thread and steam and the steady pressure of two hands holding life together when everything else fell apart. He came crawling through the dust one morning, half-conscious, caked in blood, with the stench of war clinging to his uniform like it had been stitched in. The villagers thought he was already dead. A few children ran to fetch Adisa, while others kept their distance, wide-eyed, unsure if the soldier was friend or enemy, or simply another ghost on the road. When Adisa saw him, she didn't ask where he had fought or what side he belonged to. She saw the shrapnel wound tearing into his shoulder, the fever rising fast behind his half-closed eyes, and the slow drip of blood soaking through the sash he had tied around his waist as a tourniquet. His name was Bakari. She lifted him with help from a neighbor, brought him to her hut, and laid him on the mat that had held too many dying breaths. For days he hovered between this world and the next. His wounds turned black at the edges. His lips cracked. He moaned names in his sleep, some of them. Friends, others, maybe just boys who had disappeared in gunfire. Adisa stayed at his side. She ground herbs until her fingers stained green boiled water, from dawn to dusk changed his dressings every 3 hours, with the same focus a surgeon might give in a capital hospital. When the fever finally broke, it was nearly midnight. He opened his eyes slowly as if not trusting the world to be real. The first thing he saw was her face lined with exhaustion, but calm. Her hands never stopped working. She wiped sweat from his neck, offered him a spoonful of broth, and whispered, "Rest. You're not going to die today." He tried to ask why she had helped him. She only said, "Because you were breathing." Bakari stayed for almost a month. He couldn't walk at first, and then couldn't stand for more than a few seconds. But each day with her help, he healed. And in between moments of silence and soup and sleep, he learned her name. He heard the villagers speak it with a kind of reverence normally reserved for saints. He watched mothers hand her newborns and old men nod in quiet gratitude. He understood she was more than a nurse. She was the reason the village still breathed. When the time came to leave, he wept not for himself but for what he was leaving behind. He offered her the only thing he had, a small medal from his uniform. She refused it gently. "I don't need medals," she said. "I need fewer wounds." He walked away with a limp and a story he could never forget. Years passed. The war faded into ash and memory. Bakari moved to the capital. Life was not kind, but he survived. Until the day a roadside explosion took his sight, stealing the only part of the world that had ever truly held meaning for him. But even in darkness, some names remained bright. So when a local journalist invited him to speak on a small national program, a segment on unsung heroes of the conflict, he didn't hesitate. He sat before the camera, eyes clouded, hands folded tightly in his lap. And when the host asked who had saved him, his voice didn't tremble. "There was a woman," he said. "I don't know her full name. I don't know if she had any medical training. But I can tell you this, I would be dead if not for her." The host leaned in. "Where was this?" "In a village called Tibane, middle of nowhere. We were told to evacuate. We all did. Everyone, except her." His voice grew steadier. "She stayed. I don't know why. Maybe she was crazy, or maybe she just believed in something bigger than herself. I was barely more than a boy. I had killed. I had bled. I had nothing left. And she looked at me like I was worth saving anyway." A pause. Then he said the words that made every viewer go still. "I saw many heroes during the war. Men with medals, generals with followers. But none had the courage to stay behind when the world was burning." The camera caught a tear as it rolled down his cheek, though his eyes never saw it. "And if she's out there," he whispered, "I hope she knows that one soldier never forgot." At first, the story spread like a whisper. Bakari's trembling voice, aired late at night on a mid-tier television segment, was uploaded by a university student onto a small YouTube channel. The view count climbed slowly until someone clipped one line. "She stayed when the world was burning, and then everything changed." By the end of the week, major outlets picked it up. Blind veteran credits unknown woman for saving his life. Who is the village healer of Tibane? By the second week, her image, a blurry screen capture of her treating patients barefoot, circulated on social media platforms. The world, starved for a human story in the wake of political scandals and cynicism, clung to her name like a lifeline. But fame is fickle. With visibility came suspicion. The first smear appeared quietly buried in the third paragraph of a tabloid article. Sources claim the woman known as Adisa may have accepted payments for medicine during the war. Another blog questioned her background, no verified medical training. Was she truly qualified or just another opportunist in the chaos? By the next news cycle, it had become a headline, hero or hustler. They tried to paint her as a profiteer. Photos surfaced her holding a bag of dried herbs, her receiving a small bundle of yams from a grateful farmer. The caption read, "Bartering under the guise of charity." Commentators on panel shows raised eyebrows. "We don't know the full story," one said, tapping the desk. "Is she a saint or simply someone lucky enough to catch a camera's eye?" But for every seated doubt, 1,000 voices rose. A mother from Tibane uploaded a trembling video of her holding a boy with burn scars on his arms. "That woman," she said, "gave us her only oil lamp when mine went out. She fed my child when I had no flour. She asked for nothing, not even a thank you." A former nurse posted a thread of grainy photos, torn cloth soaked in blood herbal paste curing infection. I left when the last aid truck did. She didn't. We trained under the same outreach team. I froze, she fought. She saved lives when I couldn't. Then came the soldiers. Anonymous accounts, verified ones, old men in uniforms and young ones still recovering from wounds. She treated me when my leg was rotting, one post read. She sat beside me holding my hand while I shook from malaria. No one else would touch me. She did. And then without prompting, without coordination, 3 simple words began appearing across every platform. She stayed in 24 hours. It had crossed 1 million mentions. In 48, it trended in 12 countries. People began changing their profile pictures to hers. Artists painted murals of Disa, kneeling beside a patient, a scarf tied loosely, eyes focused. Journalists who had once doubted her now ran headlines praising her as a symbol of defiance and grace. The smear collapsed under its own weight, because when the world went looking for flaws, it found something stronger: memory. The kind of memory held in a mother's shaking voice, in a soldier's scar, in a village that would have gone dark without a woman who kept lighting candles with nothing but hope and grit. And while Adisa had no phone, no television, no idea that her name had become a rallying cry, the world was already choosing sides. And they chose hers. It was discovered by accident, wedged between the yellowed pages of a dog-eared French grammar book, buried in a forgotten box inside the presidential archives. A junior staffer assigned to organize old documents from President Traoré's military years had almost tossed the book aside when something slipped out and fluttered to the marble floor. A folded sheet, faint ink, no envelope, no date, no stamp, only a name: Adisa. The staffer, unsure what to do, placed it gently on the corner of the desk. By noon it had passed through 2 secretaries, 1 personal aide, and finally landed on the president's desk beside a stack of security briefings in diplomatic cables. Traoré returned late that evening, exhausted from negotiations and speeches. He hadn't expected the letter, but the moment he saw her name in his own handwriting, slanted, uneven, younger something inside him cracked quietly open. He didn't speak. He just sat, the lights dim, the city humming beyond the tall windows. And then with hands that had signed treaties and commanded armies, he unfolded a piece of himself that had once believed only in her. The letter began without a greeting, like a thought mid-breath. I don't know why I'm writing this except that I see your face every time I close my eyes. You're not saying anything. You never do in my dreams. You just look at me the way you used to, like I was already someone before I ever became anyone. He read the words slowly, like he was afraid they might fade. It's loud here. Too many boots, too many men shouting about strategy and maps and pride. But when it's quiet and I'm alone, I remember your hands. The way they moved when you patched a scraped knee or peeled fruit with that little knife. Strong but never rushed. You never wasted emotion. You never wasted a word. Sometimes I wonder if you were real. Because I've met 100 people since I left Tibet, politicians, scholars, generals, and none of them ever made me feel like time stood still just because they listened. His fingers tightened around the page. I keep thinking I'll write to you. But what would I say? That I'm learning to lead people who would never understand where I came from. That I eat in dining halls where the food tastes like ceremony instead of hunger. That I miss a village that didn't even have running water but had you. You once told me I'd rise, and I did. But I think you always knew what I didn't, that rising isn't always upward. Sometimes it's walking into fire and choosing not to run. And if that's true, then you rose long before I ever left. He paused. A lump had formed in his throat. If I never see you again, I hope you still walk barefoot in the morning dew. I hope the children still follow you home like shadows. I hope you stayed kind. But mostly I hope you know this. If the world forgets you, I won't. If they bury your name, I'll speak it louder. No signature, just a final line pressed deep into the page, as if written with more than ink. Your silence taught me more than the academy ever could. Traoré closed his eyes. He remembered her under the mango tree, barefoot, laughing softly at something he'd said. The girl with no shoes, the girl who had given him something no rank, no crown, no office had ever matched. He had never sent the letter, because he had been afraid that her silence would say more than his words ever could. But now, decades later, the world was speaking for her, and the man who had once written to her in secret was ready to say her name out loud. No one could say exactly how the letter got out. Some claimed it was an accident, a careless moment, by an overwhelmed intern scanning old documents. Others whispered it was deliberate, a quiet act of rebellion from someone within the president's circle who believed the country deserved to know the truth. One theory pointed to his speechwriter, another to the archivist, but the name didn't matter. What mattered was that by sunrise on Tuesday, the letter was everywhere. Radio hosts read it aloud during morning shows, their voices cracking as they stumbled through the raw, uneven handwriting. Television anchors held it with reverence like scripture. Social media erupted. Celebrities, veterans, school teachers, market vendors, people who had never agreed on anything before shared the same lines in hushed disbelief. And one line echoed louder than all the rest: I built this country with the image of a woman who carried dignity when the world gave her none. It was a sentence not written for applause, not crafted for press. It was the confession of a man stripped of pretense, remembering the girl who made him human before he ever became powerful. And the country felt it. In a nation fractured by class, by war, by memory, something in the words stitched people together, thread by thread. He hadn't spoken like a politician. He had spoken like a son of the soil. A man who remembered barefoot mornings, mango trees, and a woman whose name the world had nearly buried. The backlash came quickly, but not against him. Opposition parties scrambled. Some accused the president of orchestrating the leak himself, calling it a calculated stunt to manipulate emotion. Analysts debated whether it was wise for a sitting head of state to allow something so vulnerable to circulate. They warned of the risks. He's opening himself up. He's making her more than human. He's turning her into myth. But for once, the people didn't care what the analysts said. Everywhere, voices rose to meet the letter. University students staged readings in public parks. In one northern province, a bus driver painted the line across the back of his vehicle in white. She carried dignity when the world gave her none. Children wrote it on school walls in chalk. Retired nurses wept during interviews, holding grainy photos of Adisa, whispering, "We knew. Now they all do." And in the capital, something unexpected happened. For the first time in decades, a woman with no title, no office, no wealth, no campaign began to trend above any minister or general. Not because of scandal, not because of gossip, but because her quiet, unseen sacrifices had finally found light. Meanwhile, inside the palace, President Traoré said nothing to the press. When asked by his advisors whether they should issue a formal statement, he waved them off. What would I say that the letter didn't? Still behind closed doors, he carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. The letter had been his, not for policy, not for performance. It had been ink drawn from memory, now dissected by millions. But perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. Because in every line, the nation wasn't just hearing about love. They were hearing about themselves, about the nurses forgotten after peace, about the mothers who rationed rice to send their children to school, about the teachers who stayed when the funding vanished, about every woman who bore the world's weight without ever asking for applause. The storm had begun as a leak, but it had become a mirror. And in that reflection, the country wasn't seeing scandal. It was seeing the roots beneath its rise. The moment the letter became public, the air in the capital changed, not just in the streets where crowds swelled in silent reverence, but behind the polished doors of embassies, ministries, and high-rise boardrooms, where power had always felt safe. Inside a marble-paneled conference room, diplomats shifted uncomfortably as a senior envoy from the foreign delegation set down her tablet and whispered sharply, "This woman, she's not one of us." It wasn't meant to be heard, but it was. And by the end of the day, that single sentence had spread like wildfire across encrypted texts, anonymous leaks, and eventually front-page headlines. She's not one of us. It was supposed to be a dismissal, a coded reassurance that no real danger loomed, that this barefoot village woman was still somehow beneath the fabric of power. But in the mouths of citizens who had waited years for someone real to believe, in the phrase mutated no longer a slight, a declaration. Because in that moment, the people realized something chilling: they were never meant to be part of us. Not the teachers working unpaid for months. Not the mothers denied treatment because their names weren't on the registry. Not the children whose schools had no roofs. not the veterans sleeping in bus terminals while warlords sipped foreign champagne. And definitely not Adisa. She's not one of us had been meant as a wall, but the people heard it as a match, and they lit it. Outside the gates of the presidential compound, 100 voices became 1,000, then 10,000, not with violence, but with precision, with clarity, with rhythm. They chanted in every language spoken across the land. But one phrase echoed above all, not one of you, one of us, painted on cardboard signs, written on cheeks in charcoal, echoed in classrooms, printed on the back of food delivery trucks, whispered in prisons, yelled in parliaments. The old guard panicked. Some ministers called emergency sessions. Others demanded the president issue a distancing statement. One foreign ambassador reportedly offered quiet incentives to reshape the narrative. But it was too late, because what had begun as a human story had become something no machine could contain. Adisa was no longer just a woman. She was a reckoning, not the type that demands revenge, but the kind that forces the mirror into the hands of the powerful and asks, "Now look." And for those used to hiding behind veils of protocol, her presence, her story, her name was unbearable, because she hadn't asked to belong. She never even asked to be seen. But now the world was watching, and not one of them could look away. The gate was taller than her. It stretched high above the little girl's head, like a wall meant not only to protect, but to separate stone metal and money forged into one single barrier. The brass sign read Académie Étoile Blanche, letters curled in elegant gold, shimmering like they belonged to another world. She stood in a neatly pressed uniform, second-hand but spotless. Her braids had been freshly done that morning, the pink ribbons still stiff with starch. She held her admission slip with both hands gripping it like it was magic. The guard didn't even take it. He glanced once, then again, then narrowed his eyes. What's your name?" The girl said it clearly, soft but proud. He looked at the paper, then at her again. "Who brought you here?" "My aunt," she said. "She's waiting at the corner." He didn't move. Then came the words. "You don't look like the others here. This school is selective." Her brows furrowed. "I passed the exam." The guard smiled, but it wasn't kind. "Some people don't belong even when they pass." "Go wait outside." She didn't cry. Not then. She just stepped back slowly, the paper still in her hands, staring at the gate that had already decided what she was worth. It would have ended there. But another parent, someone waiting in a car nearby, had filmed everything. And within hours, the footage was online. Within a day, it was viral. "She looks like her." That was the line the guard said to a colleague off camera. Barely audible. Almost missed. But it was caught. And repeated. "She looks like her." No name. No explanation. But the world didn't need one. They knew who her was. And so did Adisa. She saw the story on the front page of the battered morning newspaper that one of her patients had left behind after treatment. The photo was small, just a little girl standing alone, a bright pink ribbon against a heavy iron gate. But it stopped her hand mid-motion halfway through applying a bandage. She picked up the paper. Read the headline once. Then again. The words were simple, brutal, turned away for looking like Adisa. Her breath caught, not from pride, not even from anger, from something deeper, responsibility. She had spent years trying to survive, quietly serve humbly, disappear gently, and now her name was being used as a reason to deny a child. She couldn't stop staring at the girl's face. It wasn't that she looked like her, she didn't, but there was something familiar in her eyes, not fear, but a waiting silence, the kind of silence that dared the world to treat her with dignity. Adisa folded the newspaper and set it aside. That evening, the village buzzed with talk. Radios played snippets of opinion, shows debating the school's future. Protesters had already gathered outside the campus. The guard had been suspended. The headmistress had issued a careful, polished statement. Misunderstanding, unfortunate phrasing, no reflection of our values. But the damage had been done, because the world saw something clearer than any prepared apology. They saw that even in the capital, even after all the speeches, all the chants, all the hashtags, a little black girl with a ribbon in her hair could be told she didn't belong just for looking like the woman who stayed. And this time the story wasn't about medicine or war. It was about the next generation. It was about what kind of gate would greet them, and whether someone like Adisa or someone who simply resembled her would always have to carry the burden of proof just to be let in. That night, under the soft light of her hut, Adisa sat beside a fading candle, hands still and eyes focused on the darkness outside. The world had once tried to forget her. Now it was remembering her too much and for the wrong reasons. But something in her posture changed. Not fear, not shame, resolve. Because the girl at the gate was waiting. And Adisa knew the time had come to walk through one more door, this time not alone. The room was carved from polished marble and wrapped in velvet silence. Inside, a live academic panel was being broadcast from the National Assembly Hall. 5 scholars in crisp suits, 1 moderator with too many cue cards, and an audience filled with carefully chosen applause. The topic, social mobility and post-war healing. The tone sterilized. There were statistics on screen. Terms like reconciliation metrics, institutional reintegration, and poverty trajectories echoed from the stage. Every word had been filtered through committees, reworded for comfort. It was the kind of conversation that kept real pain safely intellectual. And then the doors opened. No announcement, no escort, no spotlight. Adisa stepped in, slowly, dressed not for show, but for truth. Plain scarf-weathered shoes, eyes calm. The room didn't notice her at first. The moderator was reading a quote. A guest speaker cleared his throat to add something about generational trauma. She kept walking, down the velvet aisle, past ministers, diplomats, donors. Some gasped quietly. One whispered, "Is that?" But by then she was already climbing the stairs to the stage. Security hesitated, then froze. Because by the time protocol caught up to her feet, she was already standing in front of the panel, her back to the nation's most polished experts. No mic had been handed to her. She didn't need one. Her voice, clear, unshaken, cut through the silence. I fed your mothers when the lights went out. The room stilled. I boiled leaves to lower their fevers. I walked 3 miles in floodwater to find salt when the roads were blocked. I held your brothers when they cried not from weakness, but from wounds. She looked each panelist in the eye, not with hostility, but with a gaze that stripped away every paper title between them. I cleaned your son's blood with bare hands. No gloves, no salary, no recognition. Just thread, fire, and prayer. The camera operator, stunned, turned the lens toward her. Live, unfiltered. So tell me, she said quietly, who belongs here? There was no applause, just the echo of breath held too long. Behind her, one panelist shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat, but no words came. Because what response could possibly follow that? What defense do you raise against someone who saw your nation's bones in their bare form and still chose to love it? Adisa didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply stood where no one had allowed her to stand and reminded them she had already been there long before any invitation. Then she stepped down, not rushed, not escorted, just the same steady walk of a woman who had moved through war, poverty, rejection, and was no longer interested in permission. As she reached the last step, someone stood up, then another, then another. They didn't clap. They bowed their heads. It was not submission, it was respect, a rare kind, earned, not granted. And across the nation, televisions flickered with her image. People paused mid-meal, vendors stopped mid-sale, children leaned in, because this wasn't a headline or a speech. This was a memory-voiced truth, and no one could look away. That night, she didn't return to Tibet, because by morning an official invitation would arrive, this time not for a panel, but for history. It wasn't held in the palace. It wasn't held at the embassy or a 5-star hotel with polished marble and walls lined with chandeliers. No velvet ropes, no gold-plated name cards, no whispered ranks. It was held in a garden, a wide, dusty courtyard in the heart of the capital where the trees bent with mangoes and laughter moved faster than protocol. The invitations had been hand-delivered by volunteers, not officials. They went not to generals or ambassadors, but to weavers, market vendors, midwives, teachers, mechanics, grandmothers, and children, especially children. The president had called it simply the People's Banquet. No one knew what to wear, so they wore what they had. Bright cotton wraps, faded school uniforms, boots dusted from long travel. Some came barefoot. No one was turned away. There were no metal detectors, just open gates, music, long tables draped in linen, and plates filled higher than anyone expected. When Adisa arrived, she did not come in a black car. She came by foot, quiet, steady, holding the hand of a girl from Tibane whose father had once survived an infection no one else could treat. People noticed her. Of course they did. But no one swarmed her. No one pulled out phones. There was a stillness in her presence now, not distance, but clarity. She moved like someone who knew the world too well to chase it. An usher approached gently and gestured to a front table lined with dignitaries. "Madame," he said softly, "you are invited to sit with the president." She smiled. "I already did. Years ago, under a mango tree." And she walked past the front, past the second row, past the shaded pavilion, to the edge of the garden where a cluster of young girls from the rural north sat balancing bowls on their knees, giggling nervously between bites. Their uniforms didn't match. Some had shoes, some didn't. When Adisa sat down beside them, they went silent. One girl, no older than 9, leaned in and whispered, "Why aren't you sitting up there?" Adisa tilted her head and smiled, eyes warm. "Because I'm already where I need to be." The girl blinked. "But they said you're important." "I was always important," Adisa said. "So are you." No stage was needed, no speech given, and yet across the garden ministers paused their conversations. Elders fell quiet. Even the president, seated under a flowering baobab, looked up and watched as the woman who had once fed his people by candlelight now shared mango slices with their daughters. It was not a photo op, it was something rarer, a shift, because for the first time power hadn't come dressed in polished shoes or pressed suits. It had come in the form of a woman who sat in the dust, listened more than she spoke, and knew exactly how high she had climbed without ever leaving the ground. That night, when the music softened and the lights began to dim, someone asked President Traoré if he wanted to give closing remarks. He looked toward the edge of the garden where Adisa was laughing quietly with the girls. Then he said, "No, I think tonight has already spoken." It started with a note, folded once, slipped under the door of the clinic. No name, no signature, only a single sentence written in black ink. "Stop pretending you belong." Adisa didn't flinch when she read it. She simply folded it back up, placed it inside a tin where she kept scraps of old prescriptions, and went back to bandaging a young boy's ankle. But it didn't stop there. 3 days later, a rock shattered the front window. It was thrown just before dawn when the streets were still quiet and the stars hadn't yet faded. The glass scattered across the floor like jagged salt. No one saw who did it, but the message was clear. A neighbor offered to patch the window. Adisa declined. "Let them see in," she said. "I have nothing to hide." By the end of the week, the letters grew bolder. Some typed, some scrawled in red marker. All anonymous, all venomous. "You're making fools out of men who built this country. We didn't fight a war to watch it be handed to barefoot nurses. You speak too loudly for someone who used to serve tea." Even her patients began noticing unfamiliar men lingering near the clinic, well-dressed sunglasses, even at dusk, pretending to check their phones, but never dialing. Once she spotted one standing by the mango tree across the road, pretending to tie his shoe for almost 10 minutes. The local mayor sent word, "You should consider a guard, just until things settle." But Adisa knew better. When people say settle, they rarely mean peace. They mean silence. And she had been silent enough. At night, the whispers became knocks. Light taps at the clinic's back door. A cough just beneath the window. She never opened. Not because she was afraid, but because she refused to let fear write her routine. Instead, she lit a second lamp. She left the door unlocked for patients, and she stayed. One evening, she sat with a journalist under the low roof of the clinic. The reporter was young, nervous, fumbling with a recorder. "Are you afraid, Madame Adisa?" he asked, eyes darting toward the cracked window, the darkness behind him. She looked at him calm. "They sent boys to watch me during the war, too." "You know what I did?" He shook his head. "I fed them." The reporter blinked. She continued, "Because even when hate sits at your doorstep, it's still human, and sometimes feeding it takes away its sharpness." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And now, with these threats..." She turned to face the window, its jagged edge covered by cloth. "If someone wants to silence me for telling the truth," she said quietly, Let them try. The words weren't defiant. They were grounded, worn smooth from years of resilience. She didn't mean them as a challenge. She meant them as a fact, because she had survived worse than broken glass. She had survived silence. And that's what truly frightened those who sent the letters, not her voice, but the fact that others had begun echoing it. Across the country, girls were quoting her in school essays. Women were writing to newspapers, ending their letters with, "She fed us when the world forgot us." Hashtags morphed into movements. Campaigns were launched to rename health centers after her. Old soldiers spoke of her in interviews not as a symbol, but as a memory that had kept them alive. Every threat only made her story louder. And for those who had long enjoyed the safety of shadows, that was the true danger, not that Adisa had risen, but that the world had finally stood up beside her. The story had been buried for years, not erased, just quietly forgotten. A casualty of time, fear, and the kind of silence that settles into history like dust. Until a young journalist named Idris, chasing a different story about corruption during the war, found a trail no one else had followed. A fragment in a declassified report, a redacted name, a line in a medic's field diary hidden in the thatch saved by the nurse in the valley. He almost skipped it, but something about the phrasing made him pause. And once he started pulling the thread, the cloth began to unravel. The whistleblower's name was Moussa Diabaté, once a junior procurement officer for the provisional government during the civil conflict. He had discovered that military funds, millions, had been siphoned through fake supply routes. When he spoke up, orders were issued for his arrest. Officially, they claimed he had defected. Unofficially, they wanted him dead. For 3 weeks, Moussa ran. On the 22nd day, bleeding from a gunshot wound and feverish from infection, he collapsed on the outskirts of a village with no name on any map. Tibane. She found him in the grass, delirious, mumbling in half sentences about generals' bribes names. Anyone else might have walked away. She carried him. He was burning with fever, and his blood stained her only blanket. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what he had done. She just cleaned the wound, boiled water, tore strips from her own dress for bandages, and waited. For 12 nights, she kept him hidden. The soldiers came twice. She met them at the gate, told them the clinic had been closed, that no one else had passed through. She offered them water and watched them leave, their eyes lingering too long. And then, when he could finally stand, she pointed to the edge of the forest and told him to walk west, where the roads curved toward allies. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask him to remember. She never told anyone, until now. The article broke online with a title that gripped the nation like a slap and an embrace all at once. They called her no one. She protected everyone. Within hours, it became the most shared article in the country's digital history. The details were sparse, just enough to confirm the truth, not enough to put others in danger. Moussa Diabaté, now living in exile, confirmed everything in a video call with the journalist. His voice cracked as he spoke her name. "I owe her my life," he said, "but she never wanted anything in return. She just told me, if the world forgets, that's their business. But I won't help them do it." The response was seismic. Parliament paused mid-session to address the revelation. Journalists scrambled to find any previous mention of Moussa's escape and found none. Commentators hailed it as an act of radical courage. Opponents accused her of aiding a traitor. But the people already knew who she was. She hadn't taken sides. She had taken risk, not for power, not for headlines, for a man who was hunted for speaking the truth. And once again, it wasn't her voice that told the story. It was someone else's survival, the same way it had always been. That night, she sat by her window as the wind moved through the grass outside. The tin where she kept old notes was fuller now, rock-thrown warnings, gratitude letters, scraps of stories that weren't hers but somehow always found her. And still she stayed silent. Not out of fear, out of choice. Because she knew something most people forget: the loudest truths are sometimes carried by those who never need to shout. It didn't happen overnight. No decree was passed, no monuments unveiled by state order. There were no choreographed processions, no speeches in marble halls. And yet everywhere, quietly, organically, her face began to bloom. It started in the north. A small village clinic repainted its outer wall. A child with only 4 crayons used 3 of them to sketch a woman with a blue scarf and tired eyes, one hand holding a bandage, the other resting on the head of a lion. "That's Madame Adisa," he said, pointing proudly. "And that's her lion, because she fights without claws." The mural caught the attention of a traveling teacher who snapped a photo and posted it online. Within hours, it was shared across the country, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. From that moment, the colors spread. Murals appeared on clinic walls, market stalls, schoolyards. Some were detailed, others no more than silhouettes. Always with the scarf, often with the lion, always with eyes that looked like they had seen too much but still stayed open. At first, people thought it was art, but it was more than that. It was memory, and memory, once awakened, doesn't rest quietly. In the capital, nurses began tying sky blue scarves around their necks. No one issued an order. It began with one midwife who had known Adisa during the war, then another, then a dozen. By the end of the month, hospitals across the region saw nurses wearing the same color, not as protest but as promise. A promise to stay, to serve, to protect. In schools, children started choosing her name for essay contests, a woman I admire. One girl wrote she didn't fight with a gun, but she won something bigger: respect. In marketplaces, mothers whispered her name when their daughters were discouraged. Be like Adisa, stand, even if you stand alone. And in the halls of government, where everything was planned and approved, someone noticed what was happening and asked the president if he would like to officially endorse the movement. He declined. But that night, standing alone on the palace balcony, looking out over the flickering lights of a country waking from years of forgetting, he whispered to himself, "She reminded us of who we were before we forgot." That was the truth of it. Before numbers and flags, before press briefings and titles, before power became currency, there had been people. And those people had dignity, even in rags, even in silence, even in the dim light of clinics where one woman worked with thread and fire and faith. She hadn't asked to be remembered, but the people chose to remember her anyway. Not with medals, with blue scarves, with wall paint and school poems, with lion sketches and shared glances of quiet respect. She had become something no regime, no smear campaign, no bullet or slander could erase, a reflection of who they wished to be if they were brave enough. And so the story of Adisa, once tucked inside an unsent letter, once dismissed behind a broken clinic window, now moved through every alley, every radio, every heart, not as myth, not as martyr, but as memory. Living, breathing, unstoppable. Adisa launches a scholarship fund named after her late mother Miriam, the woman who once boiled leaves to soothe fevers and whispered courage into hungry ears. Instead of foreign donors, it's villagers who contribute baskets of rice coins wrapped in cloth love letters from classrooms. Schools send letters from children addressed to the future she believes in. In the launch video, Adisa sits in her small clinic, looking straight into the camera. No makeup, no title, just truth. She speaks quietly. "We've waited long enough for permission. We don't need it anymore. All we ever needed was a chance." And the screen fades to black with the fund's name, the Miriam Fund, for every girl who stayed. A national museum opens a new permanent wing titled Women Who Carried the Nation. In the center, a portrait of Adisa draws crowds. Unlike others, she isn't standing tall or wrapped in gold. She's sitting quietly on a bench outside a village clinic wearing her worn scarf. Her hands are stained with iodine dust ink, but they rest gently with purpose. Beneath the frame, the plaque reads, "She didn't wear a crown. She carried it." Visitors linger. Mothers cry. Young girls stare, not in awe but in recognition. It's the only painting in the room where people instinctively lower their voices, not out of reverence but respect. Years pass. The spotlight fades. Adisa, now older, still walks the same dirt road to her clinic each morning. No guards, no speeches, no cameras. Children wave. Elders nod. Her pace is slower, but her steps are sure. One day, a small girl, barefoot, ribbon in hair, runs up beside her and asks, "Madam, what does justice mean?" Adisa smiles and replies, "It means you don't have to ask to belong. You just do." They walk the rest of the way in silence. Final image. Her silhouette against a burnt orange sunset, walking toward her clinic. Bag slung over her shoulder, blue scarf fluttering, no crown, still carrying everything. Adisa's story reminds us that true power doesn't need titles or applause. It lives in quiet courage in choosing to stay when it's easier to leave, and in serving others even when the world turns away. Her legacy proves that dignity is not given, it's carried. In a world obsessed with recognition, she chose impact. And sometimes the strongest voice is the one that never shouted, only acted. Question to audience. Have you ever met someone whose quiet actions changed everything without needing to be seen? Who is your Adisa? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.